Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm Meeker. I am the Deputy Director for the POPVOX Foundation. I am so excited to welcome everyone to this very first event for the Casework Navigator program. I am a former caseworker and a former Director of Constituent Services, and I say the Navigator program is something that's certainly been in my head for a few years since I was a new caseworker, looking for resources, trying to find the things that I felt like I needed to do a good job as a caseworker and then as a casework manager. There are so many more resources available for caseworkers and casework managers today, but we are still so excited to create this program to kind of bring some of those together and to really elevate the wonderful work that caseworkers do. So while we're getting started here, I'm going to be that Zoom moderator and throw up a quick poll here to hear a little bit about where y'all are coming from. So part of the point of the Navigator program, and especially of today's kickoff event, is combining the wisdom from casework experience with the innovation to take casework into the future. So I'd love to hear who's joining us. So we have new casework folks, experienced casework folks, folks from the modernized Congress world who are interested in casework. Awesome. Okay. Looks like we're seeing a really good spread here. Perfect. All right. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker today. Folks, I am so excited to welcome you, as we said, to the Casework Navigator program, and today's Ask Me Anything with experienced caseworker Katherine Long. And I will say, let me just put a flag in for the end of the event today. So we're going to take the last 10 minutes after we've kind of talked through all of our casework questions and take a look into the future, into the casework crystal ball in the year ahead for what to expect in the next year and beyond. As I said at the top here, this is part of our Casework Navigator program, so make sure that you check out our other resources, especially for those new caseworkers out there. We have some casework basics materials on how to structure your casework program, how to tackle agency stuff, how to build an intake process that makes your constituents, or builds trust with your constituents from the beginning. So don't forget to check those out, and I'll plug some other events that are coming up from our casework program down the road. But as we said, I'm so excited to introduce our speaker today, Katherine Long. Katherine has decades of experience as a public servant and an advocate for citizen involvement in government. She had the honor of serving for 15 years in Senator Leahy's state office, resolving over 4,000 complex cases and speaking with thousands of Vermonters about their experiences in government. As casework manager, she also had the very unique experience of closing Senator Leahy's casework operation after, this blows my mind, 48 years in office. Katherine's casework portfolio focused on military and veterans affairs, housing, and taxes. She also works extensively to repatriate American citizens during crisis situations around the world and to relocate our allies from Afghanistan. And before joining Senator Leahy's staff, Katherine was the Director of Public Policy for the Vermont Alliance of Nonprofit Organizations, a training fellow with the Center for Lobbying in the Public Interest, adjunct faculty at St. Michael's College, and before all of that, she is also proud to have served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Niger, speaking Zarma and the occasional French. And perhaps most exciting for me, Katherine is also joining the POPVOX Foundation as our Senior Fellow for Casework Programs. So we're excited to introduce Katherine today, and we're going to hear lots more from her over the next set of Casework Navigator events. Katherine, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
And thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here. I can't imagine a better place to have landed as a senior fellow working with you all on this project. Really, as soon as I started seeing the materials you were putting together, I thought, boy, if I could have written that, I would have. But you guys jumped in and have really put together some great resources. So I'm happy to be a part of it.
Awesome, Katherine. Thank you so much. And folks, here's how this is going to work today. I have a few questions to get us started, but this is an Ask Me Anything. We are really here to answer any questions that you have. No topic is too big or too small. And I will promise you, if we don't have the answer for you today, then we will circle back after this webinar and make sure that you get the information that you're looking for. So feel free to start jumping those questions in the Q&A feature, and we'll try to get to everybody. But to kick us off, Katherine, could we maybe have you start by just talking about how did you land in Senator Leahy's office?
Sure. Well, I was a big fan of Senator Leahy, and I had been doing human services work, and then went back and got my degree in public administration, and then was doing some public policy work, lobbying on behalf of nonprofits in the State House. And so I applied a few times to some different positions, a little bit of a joke around the office about how many times I had interviewed, but ultimately they called me when they had an opening on the Veterans Affairs casework portfolio. And I think largely the draw for me was my background in human services. I think that the previous folks in that role had, struggled with the issues that were presented, had worked really, really hard. But they felt like somebody with that background would be a good fit for working with the population of folks returning home.
That makes a lot of sense. It's awesome to hear about someone who's so excited about joining casework team. They would try multiple times. That's definitely speaks to your commitment to doing this work. And that's wonderful. Now you have such an interesting perspective over 15 years in Senator Leahy's office. Can you share a little bit about how casework changed over those 15 years and how you're aware of it changing on that longer scale of the 48 years that Senator Leahy was in office?
Yeah, absolutely. As you know, Senator Leahy served for 48 years, third longest serving member in the Senate. And what I've heard from him when he talks about casework is that when he first came to office, a lot of the senators were not as involved in casework. It was more of a House function, and it was frequently done out of the Washington, D.C. office. So when he came into office as one of the Watergate babies, and one of the early users of a car phone, actually, in the early 70s, he wanted to have a toll-free number that would reach his Burlington office and have caseworkers there. So it was a priority of his, and which I experienced for my 15 years, that we always had to have a caseworker in the office, pretty much anytime we were open. That toll-free number continued to ring, and I believe is now being answered by the great staff in Senator Welch's office. But when I first started, they handed me a Rolodex, which I know there's folks on the call here that are familiar with Rolodex, and we were told that, if there's an issue, a fire alarm, whatever, grab your Rolodex. That's what you want to take with you. And why that was important is that in those days there were people that answered the phone that really could access whatever was going on with your case. So, I might call DFAS, Defense Finance, and speak to the congressional liaison who could actually see what was going on in the case. What I noticed over time that I was there is things got much more command and control with the administration, and you much further away when you were calling a congressional liaison. They were much further away from the ability to really look at what was going on in the case, much less move it forward. So that has been a big change. Another big change that we saw sort of coming in with sequestration in the 2010-2011 kind of time period is that agencies didn't have the resources to put into their congressional liaisons. We obviously, with sequestration and budget cuts, also saw agencies start to go into backlogs, but then the congressional liaisons have been less able to resource to address those. I think that that's starting to change a little bit again, and we're seeing that, for example, Taxpayer Advocate has had more resources to answer inquiries, but that's a little bit of a pendulum that you see over time. And then finally, the other big change has been paper. Again, when I started, there were piles and piles of paper. I primarily was a person dealing with records, so I dealt with a lot of paper anyway. But especially with the pandemic, we were able to convert to almost entirely paperless.
That's amazing. I love that Senator Leahy was one of the first car phone users. He was ahead of his time technologically.
It was a big car phone.
Amazing. Yeah. But just so worth noting that casework has changed so dramatically in those 15 years. So it's interesting to just start thinking about where will casework be in the next 15 for folks who are just starting their casework careers now. And you also mentioned kind of the big events that you went through as a caseworker, as a casework manager. And I know that for folks who've been here for a few years, they've already been through several moments of crisis casework for the pandemic, for the Afghanistan withdrawal. And it seems like those kind of moments of punctuated equilibrium are a feature of casework and always have been. Do you have any advice for teams on how to kind of plan for those moments of spiking casework demand?
Sure. I know for a lot of folks who've been working the last 3 years, it feels like it's not a spike. It's been a really consistent, elevated level of volume for casework. But certainly over the 15 years, we saw spikes around the mortgage crisis, a couple of natural disasters, the Haiti earthquake, the Arab Spring, those kinds of things. And I think as a team in our office, we were fairly siloed into what our issue areas were, but it was really important that anticipating those kinds of things that are likely to become urgent. Things involving American Citizen Services are definitely a big one, that everyone on the team be familiar with who the points of contact are and how to handle that. And I think that contributes to some longevity on your team as well. If folks can't feel like they can take a vacation because somebody's going to be calling them when they're trying to spend time with their family, you're not going to be able to keep people over time. So I really think that having some kind of a mechanism on your team that people can learn, work through the cases with a mentor, learn how to deal with those crisis situations. And it's not just American Citizen Services. Another one is obviously a casualty on the military side, or urgent need for a documentation for a funeral and that kind of thing. And so I think as a team plans for those emergencies, that ultimately supports all the caseworkers.
Yeah, that's really important. And that's such a good point. I remember my team always did a little bit of kind of redundancy training among different caseworkers too. And I always thought it was fascinating that kind of helped even the experienced caseworkers pull back and look at how they were doing their own work too. So it's just a helpful exercise beyond building that kind of redundancy. That's really fascinating. We have a couple of questions that folks submitted in advance. So I wonder if we could dive into one of those. Katherine, how did you approach building your support network as a caseworker?
I would say that obviously it starts with your team. It's important, I think, even as we get busy, to try to check in with each other. Our team was really good at recognizing birthdays and other kinds of events in people's lives, taking that little bit of extra time. And sometimes I think ultimately that leadership comes from the top, but it can certainly be created at any level in an organization. I think the other piece of support can come, sort of at the next level from your delegation. And oftentimes we would carpool together, say, to a meeting at the VA with other members. And, sometimes we'd talk about work and cases that would come in common, but oftentimes we were talking about each other's families and, plans for the future. And building up those relationships can really start to help you see the bigger picture in the work you're doing. And then sort of at the next level, the great thing about the silver lining, I'd say, of the pandemic has been the ability to do this kind of thing. I know that on the Senate side, they have a couple of different Teams chats, and I understand on the House side as well. One of the great things that was stood up after the Afghanistan withdrawal by some really forward-thinking caseworkers and the folks at the EAP, Employee Assistance Program in the Senate, is monthly calls where they address things like the secondary trauma that you might experience when dealing with an emergency situation, best practices for caseworkers, sort of veering into some management issues, but also dealing with sort of the emotional and professional development piece.
That's awesome. And I know it's been great to see the expansion of those programs on both the House and the Senate side. It's really something it kind of happened after I had already left my former office, but I was just delighted to see that those are more accessible now.
And Anne, one thing I would just add to that is that in my experience, people are hungry to do a really good job. And part of the trauma that folks experience is if they feel like should I have done more? Could I have done more? What is it that I'm actually supposed to be doing? And so that's, sort of, I guess, a pitch for what you're doing here with POPVOX is that if we can connect folks to the resources to help do a better job, I think we're going to see people dealing with those crises better.
That's awesome. And Catherine, that's a perfect segue to another question that we got in the registration, which is, how do you communicate with constituents who don't seem to recognize the work that you've done? So constituents who say, you've done nothing in my case, when you've really gone to the edge of what you're allowed to do. Do you have any advice for just how to handle that situation with a constituent?
I think that that is a really tough situation, and I know everyone on the call has experienced that, and I certainly have, and I want to acknowledge that it's painful. It's painful when you've worked really hard and someone doesn't recognize that. There's a couple of casework axioms that I have, and one is that the amount of gratitude someone's going to feel is inversely proportional to the amount of effort you put into the case. So oftentimes you've help somebody with a passport, it took you 5 minutes, and they are super grateful. But someone that you've spent hours on the phone and really cared and tried to push it as far as you can, comes back and says you didn't care and didn't help me. That's really hard. I think that having clear parameters within your office for what your role is very helpful in that situation. I think, then you can sort of clearly state to the constituent, I'm sorry you feel that way, but this is what I have done to help you. And another exercise I guess I would just suggest is that can be a good time to step back, maybe write up an email or a memo to your casework manager or your chief of staff saying, here was the situation, this is what I did. These are the limits of what I can do, and maybe here's a next step. It would require legislation to address this. That exercise gives you the opportunity to practice summarizing the issues in your case and sort of building forward to possibly diving into oversight or legislation. And then you can certainly ask your chief, state director, casework manager, or somebody else to either take a call from that person or make the call. They're going to have that information.
That's so important. And that's helpful, no matter how grateful the constituent is for kind of realizing just what to do with those intractable problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Speaking of, we got another constituent question. We'd love your advice on how can you nicely, and I know the person that wrote in put nicely in all caps, which spoke to my Midwest heart, nicely push on agencies to be more responsive when they're really letting you down on a constituent request.
We've lost Anne.
Shoot, am I back?
You're back. We lost you for a second, but if you can just repeat that question.
No problem. So we had a question from someone who asked, how can we nicely put pressure on agencies to respond to constituent inquiries when they're dropping the ball?
I think in some ways the questioner answered the question, which is, I think, nicely. It is really important to realize that it's a partnership with the agencies. They wouldn't have their job if we didn't have our jobs and if the constituents didn't have the right to petition their government. So we are all players in that ecosystem. So I think building your relationships foundationally is really important, like with everything, a marriage or, your relationship with your children. Build that foundation so that when you really need to push, you have some of that capital. And I think that also realizing kind of all the some of the pressures that the agency might be under, sort of being aware of the field that they're operating in, whether it be because of who the administration is, maybe your member is on the committee of jurisdiction and has had to hold feet to the fire with the secretary or those kinds of things. Just sort of understanding the big field of vision, I think can make that interaction a little bit more helpful. And then the other thing that I think is really a great sort of forward-looking thing is that the more that we all as caseworkers connect with each other and raise things in a more systematic way, so say you're having problems with the portal at USCIS, and if a number of people raise that same concern or do it in a coordinated but nice way, they may be able to then address those issues.
That's so important, and just echoes what you said on the value of building those relationships with other caseworkers in your delegation and your region and beyond, that not only for the kind of moral and managerial support, but also for coming to agencies with a little bit more weight. That's hugely important. Awesome. So we got a question that just came in. This is such a good question, and one that I'm really excited to dig in more on over the next few events for the Casework Navigator program. But Katherine, what are the best ways casework staff can integrate their work into the office's work in other areas? So how can casework touch policy, comms, etc.?
Again, I can't emphasize relationships enough. And one of the relationships that I found to be most helpful over time was in our office dealing with the legislative correspondence. For one, those folks often end up in the LA role eventually. So by building that relationship foundationally, they come in and maybe you schedule a call and say, hey, let me talk to you about the VA. I know something about that. Here are the issues you're likely to hear. Here's how to respond. Offer to help them write their letters. You can offer to have them run a letter by you. Make sure you have really good, clear communication with them around if something falls into the gray area, maybe you could just make the phone call rather than having them struggle through a one-off letter. So that's a really key relationship. And then on the comm side, I think what I would often do when I had one of those difficult constituent cases is I'd write up that memo and I would include the press team on that as well, because they're the ones that are likely to get the call, and they may not care to look at your email when you send it, but when they get the call later, they'll remember that they had it and know who to call, so that you might be able to provide background to the reporter or those kinds of things. And then as you build those relationships, you can start be a little more proactive on ideas you may have for legislation.
Yeah, that is such good advice. And you're right. Nothing is scarier than a surprised comms director, and making sure that people are never surprised is so important.
Exactly.
We got another great question, and I know I've certainly run into this. Do you have any suggestions on resources for defining whether an issue is state or federal jurisdiction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Google was always my friend. So that was often somewhere that I might start when someone would post something that I wasn't familiar with. And while, we're not in a position to refer to non-governmental resources, still, you can sometimes find information on a lawyer's website, a news article, and that kind of thing. I think a lot of what doing casework is following the breadcrumb trail. So, you might get a little nugget from what the constituent says, and then follow that, and then follow that to the next thing, eventually figuring out what the issue is. And then the other thing I would say is just use your congressional liaisons at the agency. That's what they're there for. So you can give them a call and say, hey, and in some ways probably easier, give them a call, say, hey, what do you think of this? Is this actually federal? Medicaid, obviously a good example. Is this an issue where CMS is going to deal with it, or is it an issue where the state's going to deal with it because it's implementing? And you might find that you get a better answer by calling CMS.
Definitely. That's such good advice. The one thing I'll add to that too, from my experience, is treating your state delegation counterparts or your state house counterparts as partners as well. Obviously, that's really different depending on where you are in the country. Every state house has different kind of levels of professionalization for its state legislature. But if you're in a state where your state representatives, your state senators have staff who may do their own constituent services work, having some proactive conversations to figure out, all right, you handling this, am I handling this? When are we referring? How are we referring? Is also super helpful.
Yeah, and in our being in a smaller state, I think we would often rely on the governor for that as well.
Yeah, great point. Folks, really good questions. Please keep them coming. Again, we are here to answer your questions. But let me also throw in another one that I wanted to make sure that we cover. So I suspect that we have some first-time casework managers in our audience today, and I can't, that's got to be a special challenge, not only jumping in as a new caseworker, but then managing new caseworkers as you're learning what casework is. And Katherine, your team operated without a designated casework manager for some time until you were promoted to the position. Can you share a little bit about how you see the role of the casework manager and how that central point person can help the team run smoothly?
So in our office for a long time, we had tremendous longevity in the office, 15 years, 20 years, 12 years, that kind of thing. So we operated for a long time, in our silos, with each person dealing primarily with their issue area and then supporting each other as needed. But when we came time to starting to look at the shutting down, it became more important to be able to look at what our numbers were, and what cases were ultimately going to need to be transitioned to our wonderful and willing congressional delegation here, but and also to start to get to the closing. I think that having a casework manager can really help with the intake and the balancing of cases coming in, and realizing that someone needs a little bit more support and who's going to jump in to help with that. You have a little bit more data if you have someone at the hub of dealing with that, and then also sort of cheerleading folks to get to the point of closing cases, which is a really critical point of the work that we do and can be really difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And as someone who was managed by a wonderful casework manager starting out, I can't say how important it is to have that person being like, this one's been open on your docket for a long time. That's a super helpful role to have. We just got a really fun question, and Katherine, with your permission, I'm going to jump in on this one first.
Yeah.
It's something we've been looking into quite a bit as we get ready to launch the Casework Navigator program. So we have someone ask, where can I locate the laws associated with case management? Here's the fun part. There really aren't many. So casework has been part of Congress's function since there was a Congress. We have some really fun historical records of John Quincy Adams' correspondence with his constituents, solving problems that would sound pretty recognizable to many of us today. So casework has really been defined by case law. So casework is part of constituents' right to petition for redress. That's in the Constitution. It's also part of Congress's responsibility to provide oversight over federal agencies. These have really been developed through court cases. I can and if you want to follow up with me, I can throw my email in the chat, and I'm happy to discuss this further if you're looking for specific laws that govern what you can and can't do. If you are looking for those rules, the best place to start is the House and Senate ethics manuals. And in our basics chapter, we have a basics chapter on casework, the definition and rules. So we have a breakdown of those ethics rules that kind of run through what are the established parameters for what casework has been. But there is no one big law that says, Congress, you have to do casework, and agencies, you have to respond when Congress bugs you on constituent inquiries. So definitely recommend looking through the ethics rules. And then there are a couple of other laws that have kind of defined pieces around the margins. We'll actually cover one close to the end of this webinar today. I hope that's helpful. Katherine, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, and I was just going to mention that the Congressional Research Service, along with the indispensable directory of congressional liaisons, has a nice report on background and rules for casework that kind of covers some of those, and I believe alludes to the John Quincy Adams examples. And sort of, I'm gonna hit the extent of my historical knowledge really quickly here with Hamilton to say that pay issues for folks that served in the Revolutionary War were ultimately important factor in the compromises that came to developing the Constitution. So when you think about the work that we do dealing with DFAS or the VA, the thread of that and the importance of it goes all the way back, even though it's not always discussed.
Absolutely. That is such a good point. And anytime we can throw in a Hamilton reference. Awesome. Catherine, at this point, maybe let's turn to a little bit of a lightning round, but folks, we still do have time, so please keep your questions coming. But I wonder if we could kind of jump in on some of the big casework topics and get your best piece of advice on each one. So I mentioned our casework basics manual. So we have it split up into chapters that cover kind of the big pieces of casework. So we have a chapter on intake, we have a chapter on agency correspondence, chapter on closing cases. So maybe let's start there. Catherine, as folks are setting up their intake processes, what's your biggest piece of advice to make intake go well?
Sure. As a small office, as I mentioned, our bias was always to get the constituent as quickly as possible to the person that knew something about what they were talking about. I think that, recognizing that people are already frustrated by the time they call the office, it's really important to not have them have to repeat the story again and again. There's always like that one-off person who actually really wants to repeat it again and again. But for the most part, folks want to get to someone who will understand their problem and be able to, talk to them about that. The other sort of sidebar on that is we would work, generally try to do like 3 times a year, a little orientation with the interns and the folks answering the phones. And one of the things we would always tell them is, please don't tell someone that someone is going to help them. Tell them that someone is going to talk to them about their issue. Because again, if you set that expectation low, you can exceed it. But if you set it too high, then the result could be that they say, you said you were going to help me and you didn't. And that is a disappointment really all around. So those are my intake tips there.
That's so helpful. Such a good point about make sure you set the expectations at the beginning and make sure your interns know to set those expectations. Let me put our lightning round aside for 1 second because we had a wonderful question come in. Catherine, I think from someone you may have worked with, said something I always struggle with is the tension between casework is existing as a form of oversight, but our ability to actually advocate for a favorable outcome is so limited. How have you had success explaining that to constituents?
I think it's almost like the word advocate is it's a little bit of a misnomer, and I think that the term they gave to me at the very beginning was every proper consideration. I'm gonna, ask for every proper consideration under the existing law. So I think that if you keep that in your heart, in your mindset as you're interacting with folks, that can be a little bit helpful. But then I think the other piece is being able to communicate with them that when you hit the limit of what you can do as a caseworker, you will try to convey that back to your member on the oversight or the legislation part. And I think, there's a number of creative things that you can do with the oversight, whether that's in questions for the record or RFIs, request for information, things that give a little shot over the bow to an agency that you're interested and concerned about something. I think to the questioner, who I know is incredibly dedicated and very creative in trying to find solutions, that there is also the long view. Senator Leahy's worked on landmines for, pretty much his, entire career, and we're not there yet. But hopefully we will get there someday. And sometimes you think that something isn't going to happen and all of a sudden it's on the floor. And it does.
That's really helpful. And it sounds like if there are any new offices out there that want to carry on a wonderful legacy and are interested in landmine policy, there's been a wonderful body of work to pick up on. But that's great. Great question. Maybe let's go back to our lightning rounds. So the next big bucket we had was agency correspondence. And Katherine, you've touched on this a little bit. And let me preview for folks. We actually have a whole event on agents working with agencies on March 1st. You can sign up for that on our website. But what's your best piece of advice on getting those agency contacts right?
Yeah, I think, as I said, I think it's about the relationship, and I guess kind of going to new offices or even honestly new liaisons that, it's really fine to, set up a call and say, here, I'm a blank slate on this. I've just taken over this portfolio, really am a blank slate, and give them the opportunity to be helpful to you. Another thing that I've taken into my personal life lately as a mental model to move the conversation forward is, I know that you can help me, let's talk about how you can help me and sort of go frame it from a positive perspective. And, there are then also opportunities where, when you establish that relationship, you can start to say, and how can I help you? Are there things that, again, through legislation or oversight, my boss could be doing to help support the work that you're doing?
That's such a good point, and making it that two-way street. And sometimes there are small things too. I mean, hey, do you have a new program deadline that's showing up? Can I send that to my comms team and make sure that gets out into our state or district? Yeah, it's definitely a two-way street. That's huge. And then finally, the last bucket, closing cases. We've touched on this a little bit today and how important and how difficult it is, but best piece of advice for making sure that process just finishes on a great note for all the great work that you've done.
So I think probably everyone here knows that your goal is for your boss to deliver the good news, and I guess for the agency to deliver the bad news is sort of the corollary there. So I think that and I've learned this from personal experience, if you have a lower number of cases, you're going to be more able to track when that good news is ready to pop, and be able to get it to your boss, or letter, email, phone call, however you in your office decide you want to share good news. So if you keep that as the end game, that can be helpful to start to have a routine for yourself to go through and get those other cases closed. It's also really helpful, I think, to kind of zero in on what is my role, and decide within your office, for example, are we going to close, a long-term immigration case that might be 10 years to resolution? We get them a response, we put the onus back on them to contact us if they want another update, and then we close the case. And sort of defining what a case actually is the case the inquiry, and then you gave them a response and you closed the case. I often had a lot of people that I was in frequent contact with, and depending on how your case management system is set up, you may be able to still put notes in there when the person calls, even if you don't have the case open.
Definitely. And that's a great point. That one's really going to depend on your CRM features, but yeah, if that is available to you, that's a huge help. Awesome. So we have one other audience question that's come in, and then we will tackle this one and then maybe turn to our casework crystal ball and the look ahead, and save some time for last round of questions at the end. Katherine, maybe let's take this one a little bit broader. We have someone asking, do you have tips or secrets in navigating USCIS cases? Can you talk maybe about your resources for learning different casework portfolios?
Yeah, USCIS was one that wasn't my primary area, but again, I have my colleague who handled immigration had a standing date on Cape Cod in May, and it was usually gone for 10 days, right when the agriculture visas were all needing to be approved, so that folks could get out into the orchards and whatnot, to do that work. So we would get those kinds of calls, and I think that I often relied on with some of the USCIS cases, the advocate or the attorney or somebody to tell me, can you tell me where that case is? And then, I even though it's not something I know about, as long as I know where it is, I can start to follow that breadcrumb trail. So in that regard, a lot of times with a case that in an area I wasn't familiar with, the best piece of advice I would get is ask them to give you the receipt, ask them to give you the paperwork that they have, because it's easy to kind of go off not fully prepared, and then actually you see the receipt and you say, oh, now I understand what's going on. So that's something I don't like to, I don't subscribe to the let's slow walk my coworker so that they can deal with it when they get back. But I do think that getting that information can certainly compile it. And then if it turns out you don't know how to deal with it, you'll at least have all the information when they get back.
That is such a good point. Oh yeah, we have a similar question coming in. VBA cases. I remember these very clearly.
Yeah.
So these are taking 2 years. How do you get them to consider congressionals as a priority? 2 years is too long to get an answer for a constituent.
Yeah, I think that that's what, kind of going to your casework crystal ball, these national work queues have really made it difficult for congressional offices to do anything. And I know at my local VBA, they were told that they were not allowed to pull a case in and work it, even when they could see that there'd been an error for some reason it should have been worked. So I would start to go to the regional office in that case. So it's kind of the opposite of my typical philosophy, which is to go as at the lowest level and the closest relationship, to go up to the VBA regional director, or then up to the next level. I think this is also an area where if the cases are routinely taking 2 years, maybe it's time for a dear colleague letter or something to start to push them to figure out how they can get an answer back sooner. We used to also have, and I don't know if every delegation has this, but we would have quarterly briefings with the VBA at the regional level. So they used to be in person, but then went to calls with Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire. And so that's something you should definitely ask for if you're not already having those. And going back, like on the VA side, pensions were a big issue for a period of time. And I think when offices started asking for briefings from, for example, the Philly Pension Management Center, things did start to improve a little bit. So as you work all of those different levers in addition to that individual case, I think you can start to make some progress.
Yeah, absolutely. And that comes back to what we were talking about work with your delegation colleagues. That's one where you coming in by yourself to say, what's going on, isn't going to do as much as if you can come in with, hey, and I have this letter that's been signed by 20 offices because I've worked with caseworkers in 20 offices to figure out what's going on here. Two other resources to mention too, and this is one to run through your legislative team, but talking to committee staff and seeing if they have any insight into what's going on, or if they can tell you about just legislative fixes that are on the horizon that'll help you communicate with those constituents. That's going to be helpful. And the last thing especially for the VA, so obviously you usually want to work with as Katherine said, with your local offices and with your regional offices, but the central congressional liaison, the Office of Congressional Legislative Affairs, can also sometimes maybe pull a couple more strings. And that ACLA office does actually track national trends from caseworkers that they're hearing from. So that team can sometimes lean on folks within the VA that you don't have access to. So it's definitely a back pocket if you need to kind of thing to do, but it's worth noting that it's an option. But such a good question. Awesome. Katherine, thank you so much for sharing your very hard-earned, hard-won wisdom. We so appreciate it. And folks, we will have a little bit more time for questions at the end. So if you have anything else, friends with caseworkers who work for committee and subcommittee leadership, yes, that is such a good point. Double click on the point that was just made in the Q&A. But if you have other questions, please continue to put them in the chat. Like we said, we'll come back to questions at the very end. But if we don't get to your question today, we will send around some written notes with thoughts and answers for you. So at this point, as we've said, we've talked about what you learn from experience in casework, what casework has been like, and now we're going to shift to have a little bit of fun and just spend the last few minutes of our time together today talking through some things on the horizon that may impact casework over the next year and beyond. All right. Perfect. So the casework crystal ball, like we said, some of these may have immediate impacts for your casework. Some of them may have impacts in 5 years. Some of them may have impacts in 10 years. But we think for kind of future-oriented casework and future-proofing your casework, they're good things to keep an eye on. So let's start with a few developments that are happening within Congress itself. The big thing to take away here is that there's been more conversation about casework, about the tools available for casework, about the importance of casework for Congress than has happened in a long time over the past few years. Some of this was kicked off by the recent transition to the 118th Congress, especially on the House side. I think we can probably guess that many offices on this call were impacted by a bit of a bumpy start to the 118th. Whether that's offices that have been around for a while, getting conflicting guidance from agencies on whether they can advocate for constituents as a member-elect, or new offices when you got stuck in the holding pattern of not being able to set up your emails yet. This put casework in the discussion, in a public discussion about what is Congress's role in a way that's really exciting. That's also building on some momentum over the last few years of reformers within Congress talking about casework and making casework a priority. If you are not familiar with the work of the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, then I feel like I haven't done my job, but it's definitely worth taking a look at. This was a bipartisan Select Committee on the House side that's worked for the past 3 years to take a look at Congress, to take a look at how should this institution work better. Excuse me, I have a visitor here. How should Congress work better? What can Congress do to reform? What can Congress do to future-proof itself? And casework was a huge part of what they talked about. So the committee issued 200 plus recommendations, many of which have been implemented, some of which are in the process of being implemented. And that committee is no longer functioning, but its work has been picked up by a new select committee, a select subcommittee on House administration. So the subcommittee on modernization, the committee on House administration, is tasked with carrying forward a lot of those recommendations from the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, including some casework focused recommendations like increasing the resources available to caseworkers, making that transition easier to help new offices get set up quickly to start serving constituents, and looking at how can we nationalize casework data so that you're not just looking at your own case data for what issues are you seeing from constituents, but how are those reflected across the country? What are other caseworkers seeing? To kind of better figure out that coordination and targeting that we've talked about. Senate folks, I wish I had updates for you for exciting modernization things happening on the Senate side. There definitely are some, nothing quite this formal yet, but we have hope that we'll see some similar stuff on the Senate side. Then moving beyond Congress itself to agencies, some big changes happening that will definitely have a casework impact. Coming back to our question earlier about laws for casework, this is one of the very few on the books with a few laws on the books that actually describes casework responsibilities. So this is the 2019 Cases Act that you may be familiar with. Cases required OMB to work with federal agencies to figure out a way to accept digital Privacy Act release forms, which, as many of us know, would just be a huge step forward from always having to get a wet signed PARF to get a response from agencies. However, you may notice this was passed in 2019. It is the year of our Lord 2023, and this has not yet happened for most agencies. So GAO just issued a new report looking at the implementation status of cases, and surprise, found delays, a variety of different reasons given for those delays, mostly that agencies are just struggling with a huge modernization backlog, and this has fallen to the bottom of the pile. But also some interesting detail about how agencies are doing this. So for caseworkers who are already working with different agency portals for submitting your casework, you're kind of getting a preview for what your constituents are going to go through once cases is up and running. That instead of signing the Privacy Act release form for your team, constituents may have to go through different agency portals to get that PARF signed on the agency side before your team can take a look. And there are different mechanisms that agencies are using for that. Some are using login.gov, some are using off-the-shelf software, some are developing their own proprietary portals. So it's just something to keep an eye on, that this is obviously a huge step forward for accessibility in casework, but it's still a work in progress, and there's definitely going to be some bumps as this comes through. The next big thing, so you may or may not have seen these, but there have been two big executive orders in the last year or so that are definitely going to have a significant impact on how agencies are working to continue developing how the constituents interact with those agencies. So this is the first big one. You'll see this referred to by agencies as the CXEO. It's the Customer Experience Executive Order. And the other one actually just came out yesterday. That's the Executive Order on Further Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities. What these both do, especially the CXEO, the Racial Equity and Underserved Community one, obviously is a little bit too new to figure out exactly what's going to happen. But the CXEO requires a group of, I think, 25 or 35 high impact service providers. So agencies that you will be very familiar with as caseworkers to designate high level customer experience officers and make improving the customer experience a high priority for the agency. What that means for caseworkers, and same thing for the racial equity EO, agencies are also required to develop racial equity teams who are kind of looking at disparate impacts of programs on constituents. What that means for caseworkers is just you should be aware that the agencies, the program staff that you're working with are getting this pressure from the top down to fix the way constituents interact with those agencies. And then you as caseworkers are part of the pressure up from the bottom, and also pressure from the side, and also pressure from the top to make sure that agencies fix these problems. So for a lot of agencies, it's kind of the big kickstart to carry on a lot of the modernization efforts they've been working on for decades. For other agencies, this is a little bit of a poke in the rear to actually get moving to make sure that that constituent experience is better. But again, whenever you're working with agency liaisons, especially folks who are like a few steps below secretary level, just being able to use the same language that they've already used in these customer experience plans can't hurt to actually make sure that you get heard. All right, and then moving beyond agencies into the world at large, here's where things go off the rails, and we're gonna have a good time. If you've been following all of the fun stuff with ChatGPT and OpenAI, and Bing has an AI-enabled assistant now, apparently. Bard has one that dropped Google's stock like 8% in one day. The point is that AI-driven chatbots are an increasing feature of customer service. So this is just a fun anecdote that may be relevant for casework. So this is a screenshot from Do Not Pay. Do Not Pay is a startup using ChatGPT-enabled AI interfaces to help people navigate customer service. So we've had some really funny customer service AI battles recently, where Do Not Pay has been able to help people like lower their cable bill using an AI. They've been doing great until they actually planned to send someone into a courtroom with ChatGPT on an earpiece and were immediately threatened with jail time for unauthorized practice of law. So what this means for caseworkers is, I know you all get the occasional case for folks really struggling with a private company. I would expect to see constituents start to have some issues with AI customer service for big companies. And I would also start to see constituents have difficulties with AI chatbots for federal agencies too. If you caught the big CX event on Tuesday, where a bunch of customer experience officers at federal agencies gathered to talk about their CX plans, a couple of them mentioned planning to integrate chatbots into their customer service plans. So I'd definitely be aware this is going to be one new way that your constituents interact with agencies, which means one new way that you could get casework. The other thing to just flag here is, so some data scientists, political scientists have started to raise the alarm a little bit for what this means for the way constituents interact with Congress. More on the side of lobbying for if just AI-enabled floods of outreach to member offices, that's really difficult to tell which is an AI, what was written by an AI and what was written by a person. It's worth noting that it would probably be helpful for offices to start thinking about how do you figure out who is a constituent and who is a person and who is not, especially for casework. If any of these kind of big floods of AI-driven outreach just even seem to have a casework angle, that could be really difficult for just navigating a flood of folks coming in. So definitely worth just being a little bit proactive with your team to figure out how are you going to prove who's real and who's not. But to end on a positive note for what this means for caseworkers, y'all, I don't know about you, but when I was working with a CRM, my phone notes were like disgusting. I always had to edit them before I could turn my case over to anybody. I take notes as I'm typing. The spelling is terrible. The grammar is an abomination. It is very possible that by adding something like OpenAI's ChatGPT into a CRM software, you could automatically turn those gross, ugly phone notes into beautifully formatted, ready to go inquiries to agencies, beautifully formatted, ready to go emails to constituents that sound exactly like you are training an AI on your tone and your voice in your email. I think we're a long way from seeing this actually happen, and there are definitely also some ethical and political concerns for making that happen. But it's worth saying this is a technological revolution that's happening right now. And it's worth just caseworkers thinking about how could this help in addition to how could it make your job harder. So there is my whistle-stop tour for things to expect in the next year of casework. Like I said, we're really excited to focus on some of these and some of those kind of basic block and tackle how to do casework topics over the next year and beyond. So if you are interested in finding out more, again, popvox.org/casework for our basics resources, for information on our professional development series. Signups for that one are going to open up later this month. And we're really excited to kind of keep the conversation going with all of you over the next months and beyond. So we have just a few minutes left. Do we have any questions from folks? Any last questions on casework, future of casework? Ask me anything for Katherine on her experience.
And I just wanted to
or Katherine, any reactions on
yeah,
AI
no, I
and
just
all of
want to
the-
jump in on the executive order piece, because I think it kind of goes to some of the questions that came up before, is being aware of something like that executive order gives you sort of another place to have a conversation. And it may not be with the congressional liaison that's answering the phone. It may be something where, you ask to meet with the Veterans Experience Office, that's rolling out because of that executive order. But there are some real consequences that can happen. And one, I think, is FEMA changed its rules around the kind of acceptable documentation it would take for proof of ownership when they realized that in more racially diverse communities, people didn't have that. So I think we may start to see some improvement in the way that agencies deal with constituents. I think one of the things that I would love to see is that they are incorporating that caseworker feedback into those conversations.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And it's funny, actually, looking, again, we've been doing a little bit of historical research on casework as we get ready to launch this program. And in the 1970s, OMB did a study where they surveyed congressional caseworkers about the problems that they were seeing in federal agencies back then. I would love to see this be a bigger part of how agencies do their customer experience and customer service survey work. So it's such a good point that caseworkers have played that role in the past, and there is that scope for them to play that today. Such a good point. All right. Seeing no additional questions, thank you all so much for joining us today. Again, this is the kickoff event for the Casework Navigators. We hope this has been helpful. If you have suggestions for future topics, for things you'd like us to focus on, for additional manual chapters that would be helpful for your team, please, the door is wide open for those suggestions. You can email us at casework@popvox.org, which I've just put in the chat, or reach out to me or Katherine directly. We are delighted to have quick conversations with you if it's helpful to just have that conversation instead of shooting us an email. And we're looking forward to continuing the discussion with you in future events. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.